Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon if you're here in our time zone, or good evening. I know if we might even have some good mornings. We really appreciate your being here for this wonderful event. I'm Hannah Riley Bowles. I'm here in my capacity as co-director of the Women and Public Policy program here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before we get started, I also would like to recognize our colleague at the Women in Public Policy program, Anisha Asundish, who is our Director of Research and Programs, for organizing our event today in collaboration with the LGBTQ plus Student Caucus and also the Harvard LGBTQ plus staff and faculty ERG. So we are grateful to all those who've created this opportunity for us today. Before we go any further, I'd like to offer a quick land acknowledgement. WAP and the Harvard Kennedy School are located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. We honor this tradition and work toward a gender equity agenda that addresses the needs of all women, including Indigenous women and Indigenous communities. Today's event is organized in recognition of International Transgender Day of Visibility, which took place this past week on March 31st and is dedicated to celebrating transgender people and to raising awareness of discrimination faced by transgender people worldwide. We are honored today to have Professor Thekla Morgenroth presenting on why people defend the gender binary. This is a critically important question for the study of gender, for the politics of gender, and for people's lived experience. And they are a leading speaker, a leading thinker on this topic within the field of psychology and influencing many folks beyond that. Dr. Thekla Morgenroth is an assistant professor of social psychology at Purdue University. Their research examines why and how people maintain social categories and hierarchies with a particular focus on the gender-sex binary and its consequences for women and members of the LGBTQ plus community. Some of their current projects include research on opposition to policies and practices that challenge the gender-sex binary, the psychology of different feminist ideologies, the link between gender nonconformity and identity denial, and moral arguments made in the context of controlling women's bodies, for instance, in the context of sex work or abortion. Dr. Morgenroth serves as the principal investigator with the Unicorn Lab. And in this lab, they study how and why people defend and maintain social categories and hierarchies that of the character that relate directly to their research I was just describing. In their paper on defending the gender-sex binary, their paper defending the gender-sex binary is featured in WAP's Gender Action Portal, and it is one of the top 10 most viewed articles on the website with over 12,000 views now. Our speaker, Dr. Morgenroth, will speak for about 40 minutes, and then they'll take questions for about 15 minutes or so from our audience. So we'll ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the talk. Anisha will lead the Q&A to facilitate that process. So please use the Q&A function on Zoom to get your question in. And we do ask that any audience questions be brief, that they be on topic, that they be posed in the form of a question and related to the presenter's presentation. Wonderful. Please join me in thanking Professor Morgenroth, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to share my work. I will start by sharing my screen. I also see that someone has raised their hand and I think said something in the Q&A, but I don't know what the question meant. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so can y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, great. Okay, I'm gonna now minimize this window where I see all of you so I can actually see my slides. So I won't see it if anyone raises their hand or tries to gesture to me. So if anything like is going wrong, just feel free to interrupt me. All right, so today I'm going to present some of my work of why people defend the gender binary. I will start off with like some theoretical background and then present work from one of my recent empirical papers. I'm a social psychologist by training, so I usually present this work to other social psychologists or other psychologists at least. I will try to make this more accessible for a non-psychology audience, but if at any point anything is super unclear and you just need more detail or need me to define something, please feel free to just ask clarification questions. I'm happy to explain in more detail what I'm talking about. But anyway, so this is the big question: why do people defend the gender binary? And I'm just going to start off by sort of what really made me interested in this topic. So across the last few years, we've really seen a shift, or across the last 10 years or so, in how gender is perceived. So for example, Germany has now a legalized third gender that they have to use in sort of all legal contexts. And we also have seen a growing visibility of and support for transgender people. And all of that is amazing, but at the same time, there's this very strong and very vocal opposition that we see to these changes. So for example, we can see that reflected in these recent drag show bans, even though that is not necessarily aimed at transgender people, it has implications for transgender people. And what I find particularly interesting is that these anti-trans sentiments and the support for these anti-trans bills really comes from a range of different groups that you wouldn't necessarily think have a lot in common with each other, such as some conservative groups and some feminist groups who seem united in this anti-trans sentiment. And I've presented this slide. So this is already, these numbers are already outdated. I presented that like maybe 2 weeks ago. And what we see here is the number of proposed anti-trans bills in the US across the years. I made the very first version of a similar presentation in 2018, where the number of bills was under 50. It's now only the beginning of April in 2023, and we're already at around 450 just for this year. So there has been this really large surge of anti-trans bills that have been proposed and also that are passing. Of course, not all of these pass, but a good chunk of them does. And this is kind of what that looks like across the United States. The light blue states and dark blue states are the ones where trans rights are protected and there is a low risk of that changing. And the red states are the ones that have the worst active anti-trans laws, or where there is a high risk of it changing. I'm currently in Indiana, that's where I live. And there you can see that's a pretty dark red state. And there's also an imminent potential to raise the risk category. So that's kind of what the United States looks like. So at the moment, it's a very polarizing issue. And there is like an increase in these anti-trans bills that take all kinds of forms. So that can be like related to trans-affirming healthcare, banning trans athletes from competing in sports, kind of having these sex-segregated spaces by sex rather than by gender identity, preventing schools from covering LGBTQ topics, including trans topics, and maybe the most extreme ones are even ones that would give employers, businesses, and even hospitals the ability to discriminate against or deny service to transgender people. And so why is this happening? I'm interested in what is driving this opposition. You would think that, especially among, I'm particularly interested in why feminists do have this these opposing views, but I'm also more generally interested in what is driving this opposition. And in my work, I focus on the power of the regulatory power of the gender sex binary and the role that that plays. So what do I mean by the gender sex binary? The gender sex binary is this ideological system that is widespread in modern Western societies. And according to this ideology, biological sex is binary and dictates binary gender. So there's kind of two groups of people according to this framework. One group has XX chromosomes, will develop typically female bodies, for example, with ovaries, a vagina, breasts, and the ability to carry children, have high levels of estrogen, and so on. And that group of people will identify as a woman, and will also act in line with the feminine gender role, meaning that they'll be warm and caring, attracted to men, interested in romance novels, all the sort of stereotypes that are associated with women. And then there's the second group of people, and that group has XY chromosomes, will develop typically male bodies and will identify as men and will act in line with the masculine gender, also be assertive and strong, attracted to women, interested in weightlifting and boxing and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the idea of the gender binary. Of course, we know this isn't actually an accurate reflection of gender. So there's people who have XX chromosomes but do not develop typically female bodies. So that might mean that they might not develop the sort of secondary sex characteristics associated with that, or they might just not have the ability to carry children and so on. And we also know that there's people with XX chromosomes who do develop typically female bodies, but who do not identify as women, but might identify as men or as non-binary people, or a range of other identities. And of course, we also know that there's many people who have XX chromosomes, develop typically female bodies, identify as women, but do not act in line with the feminine gender role, because they might not be particularly warm or caring, they might not be attracted to men, and instead they might be, for example, very assertive, very ambitious, or be in male-dominated fields. And of course, the same is true for people with XY chromosomes. So this is just not an accurate representation of what gender is like. And so that kind of begs the question of, okay, but like, if this isn't an accurate representation of gender or sex, or the sort of relationship between sex and gender, then why do we believe this? Like, what is happening here? My research tries to sort of answer that question, at least to some extent. And so I'm drawing here on work from outside of psychology. So part of my work is based on Goffman and sort of this idea that gender is a social performance, a form of impression management. And I take from that the metaphor of theater and of performance, of how we kind of do gender in everyday life. And I also draw a lot on Butler and their work on gender performativity. So gender performativity goes a step further than performance. So it's not just you perform gender, but you create gender through the performance. So the idea here is that gender is created through its performance, and without this performance, gender wouldn't even be a thing. When I talk to my students about this, I often give the example of other characteristics that are real, but like we give them power through the social world and make them, we don't give them power and don't make them a thing. So for example, there's typically two types of people in the world. Some people have earlobes that are attached to their head, and some people have non-attached earlobes. You probably have never thought about this very much because it's not something that we give meaning. But of course, if we've suddenly started acting differently because we are told, oh, you're a person with attached earlobes, you should behave this way, or we divided kids into groups with attached and non-attached earlobes, we gave them different spaces, different places to play, different toys to play with, we told them this is not the thing that you should do as a person with attached earlobes, and so on, discouraged them from playing with people who have different earlobes, told them that they should probably marry someone with different earlobes later on, then that would become a thing. We would like perform that role, and that would suddenly create a meaningful social category. Right now it's not, but we do that with gender. So the idea here is not that like sex and gender don't exist or aren't important, but just that we create that through our own performance and through the kind of social repercussions that we face if we don't perform gender right. But Butler's work goes beyond that. So their work is also a call to action to disrupt the gender binary by causing gender trouble. And that's a term I will also sometimes use throughout this presentation. I'll explain in more detail what exactly I mean by that. And so based on this, we've created, and on a lot of psychological work and psychological theory, we've created this framework that we call the inner workings of the gender-sex binary, in which we kind of draw on this metaphor to explain how gender is performed and how that then gives this impression of these two binary categories that I explained in the beginning. So the idea here is that the performance of gender happens through three different elements. So there's the character in this binary framework, that is the character of a woman or a man. Of course, there can be many other characters, but that's kind of how it's set up in this framework. And that can both mean who do you identify as? And I'm not saying character or like this performance metaphor does not imply that that isn't based on a sort of meaningful inner sense of self. So you can really have a very meaningful inner sense of self, of being a woman, of being a man, of being non-binary. And also this character refers to what you think someone else is when you see them and categorize them in one way or the other. And the character is performed through the costume and the script. So the costume is the gendered appearance and gender presentation. When we talk about this, we mean here both the body and the presentation of the body. You might think that those are really different things, but I'm finding it very hard to make a distinction between those two because our presentation of the body is so inherently gendered and also so inherently ingrained. So like, for example, if you think about body hair, that is something that men are encouraged to keep and women are encouraged to get rid of. And of course, you could also think about the fact that if no one shaved their body hair, then yes, people who identify as and are identified as women on average have less body hair than men do. But that is, of course, exacerbated through this socialization processes and through this pressure on women to shave off their body hair. And it's almost impossible to have a neutral body. There is no neutral body. Like, women have to make a decision to either comply with this norm or not comply with this norm. But either way, they make a decision about the presentation of their body. There's no neutral or natural body that is kind of seen without this cultural lens. And so that's why we mean talk about both the body and the presentation of the body when we talk about the costume. The script is kind of all these gendered behaviors that we do, the movies that we like, the hobbies we have, how we talk, the occupations we go into, all those kinds of things are the script. And in this binary framework, those three things are usually aligned. So someone who identifies as a woman will present as a woman and act in line with the script. So she will also act femininely and dress femininely. So the costume and the script can really be used both to communicate something about your inner sense of self. So if you identify as a man, then you can use the costume and the script to communicate that to other people. And other people can use that to infer something about you. So if you see someone who maybe wears a dress and high heels and has long hair and wears makeup and wears jewelry, then you might assume that this person is a woman, given that you didn't necessarily have time to ask that person, but that's kind of how it works. Now, I'm a social psychologist, so I don't really think that these things take place in the vacuum. I know that this takes place in a social and cultural context. That's what we call the stage in our work. So that is kind of the physical and cultural context in which gender is performed. And in our society, it is set up to kind of highlight binary performance and obfuscate non-binary performance or anything that isn't in line with that. So if you think, for example, about physical spaces, when you go to the bathroom in any sort of public building, often you have to choose between a women's bathroom and the men's bathroom. So there's only two options. This also includes laws. So for example, which genders are legally, what are you allowed to have on your driving license, on your birth certificate, in your passport, like whether those are only two options or multiple options. And it also includes things such as language. So for example, if you speak if you say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, he or she, all of those things are things that sort of imply that there are two and only two genders. And so this is how kind of the gender binary is reinforced by people doing that and by specific things happening when this doesn't happen. So usually character, costume, and script are aligned. And when they're not aligned, then that is kind of what we call gender trouble. Then something isn't quite right. And people have different ways that they can react to that. They can, for example, just realign the other things. So if someone is presenting in a very feminine way and acting in a very feminine way, but saying, I identify as a man, they might deny that identity and just process that person as a woman. Or they might actively try to dissuade the person from acting that way. And for example, backlash against women in leadership, sort of violence against trans people, violence against other LGBTQ people, those can all be seen as sort of a form to force people to realign character, costume, and script. And what happens so these are the different forms of gender trouble that we look at in our work. So there's performance-based gender trouble. So for example, playing a different character, putting on a different costume, or deviating from the script. So those are all things that individual people can do through their performance. But what I'm actually particularly interested in is context-based gender trouble. So kind of disrupting the stage and how we set up the stage to kind of highlight or disrupt this framework. And here I mostly in my work focus on two different forms of context-based gender trouble. One is degendering and one is multi-gendering. Degendering refers to any policies or practices that kind of get rid of gender. and try to get rid of the salience of gender in our society. So for example, an example in the legal space would be to get rid of gender on passports. In language, it would be replacing things such as he or she with just the neutral they. Or in space, it would be just having unisex spaces that aren't gendered and aren't kind of where gender isn't even mentioned. Multigendering, on the other hand, refers to policies and practices that highlight the non-binary nature of gender. So that would include, for example, saying he, she, or they, having a third gender option or a fourth or fifth on legal documents, or having multiple spaces for people who have other identities other than male and female. And in some of my past work, I've looked at people's reactions to that. It seems that generally degendering is less popular than multigendering, I think, because it still affords some of these psychological benefits that these categories we have gives us. But if any of these things happen, any form of gender trouble, I argue, can lead to different forms of threat and in turn to efforts to reinforce the gender-sex binary. And that's kind of why people have these reactions that I talked about in the very beginning, these like sort of strong reactions to trans people, to use of gender changing more generally. And I here distinguish between three different forms of threats. So personal threat, group and identity-based threat, and system threat. So personal threat is anything that kind of affects people personally. So for example, a man's status. So lots of men have more status, and that is partially afforded to them through the gender binary, and which is also a patriarchal system. And so when you change that system and disrupt that system, that might threaten a specific person's status as a man, or like the sort of power that this man has in society. So that would be a form of personal threat. Group and identity-based threats are ones that affect sort of the groups that you belong to and the identities that are sort of associated with that. So for a lot of people, gender identity is a very important part of how they see themselves. And so it kind of tells them who they are and who they're not and where they belong, and gives them solidarity and all those sort of good things that groups can do. But of course, then if you like mess with those groups and those group boundaries, that can be really threatening and also lead to efforts to reinforce the gender-sex binary. And lastly, system threat, that's kind of based on system justification theory, which is a theory that explains why people support systems even when they do not benefit them. So systems are just nice, like humans are. We need heuristics. This is a complex world. We need to kind of reduce the uncertainty and the complexity of the world, and systems do that, and gender is a nice system that does that. And so disruptions to the gender-sex binary also cause system threat. And all of these things can then lead to efforts to reinforce the gender-sex binary, including some of these anti-trans laws. And that's what I want to focus on next, and specifically a form of personal threat in this context. And so the threat that I want to talk about here is the threat to women's safety that is often mentioned in the context of trans-inclusive policies, particularly policies that allow trans women access to women-only spaces. This is a project with my collaborators here on the right, Jordan Axt and Erin Westgate. And I want to start off with a quote from J.K. Rowling that I often use in these contexts because it really illustrates the arguments that are being made in this context. So what she says here is, I want trans women to be safe. But at the same time, I do not want to make natal girls and women less safe. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, then you open the doors to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. So the argument here is that I support trans women. This has nothing to do with trans women. I'm not bothered by trans women at all, but I think cisgender men might abuse policies that allow trans women to come into these spaces and gain access to vulnerable women. And so this is one of the most common arguments in debates about trans rights. And of course, it seems reasonable on the surface. Of course, women have a right to be safe from gender-based violence. We know that men are the primary perpetrators of harassment and sexual violence, for example, and we know that women are the primary targets. Of course, women should have safe spaces. But I'm not so convinced that this is actually what is driving people's opposition. One, because these arguments often also come from people who in other situations care very little about women's safety, and also because it just doesn't really make sense. Because if you really wanted things to be based on your sex assigned at birth, that would mean that transgender men whose sex assigned at birth was female would have to use the women's bathrooms they often look completely indistinguishable from cisgender men. So in a sense, this would make it much easier for cisgender men to access these spaces. They could just claim to be transgender men. So this doesn't even achieve the thing that it's saying it's achieving. So I'm not convinced that this is really what is driving it. So the research question we were investigating here was, do opponents of trans-inclusive policies accurately report the underlying reasons for their opposition, or are they just using these concerns about male violence as a convenient subterfuge to oppose these policies without seeming prejudiced? Because of course we know that no one wants to seem prejudiced. We live in a society that doesn't really tolerate prejudice, at least openly, at least in most of the society. So we ran a bunch of different studies. I'm going to present 4 of the correlational studies in meta-analytic form, meaning we combined them all together and kind of analyzed them as one big data set rather than as individual studies. The results are pretty consistent across the different studies. Then we also ran 2 experimental studies to kind of make stronger causal claims about these mechanisms. And I'm going to start off with the correlational studies here. So across these studies altogether, we had almost 1,900 participants. They were recruited online, and they were all cisgender women and men from the US and the UK. And we kind of described to them these types of policies that would give transgender women access to women-only spaces, and just asked them to self-categorize as opponents or supporters. So we asked them, in general, would you say you oppose these policies, or in general, do you support these kinds of policies? And then we also measured their support or opposition, so their policy views on a scale, so that we gave them different statements, and then they indicated their support on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a scale from 1 to 7. And we had different items. They were slightly different across different studies, but here's an example from one of the studies. So some of the items are, for example, women's shelter should be accessible to anyone who identifies as a woman, or transgender people should be able to use the bathroom of the gender they most closely identify with, regardless of whether they've have received hormone replacement therapy or gender confirmation surgery. So people just indicated how much they agreed with that, and that we averaged that out across the different items, and that is our measure of policy views. And then we just, after they did that, we just asked them why. Like we asked them, we're interested in the reasons why you feel that way. And we asked about 2 reasons in particular, so their feelings towards transgender people and their thoughts around violence committed by men. We again asked this slightly differently across the different studies, but generally we were just like, okay, to what extent do your attitudes towards trans people and your sort of fear of male violence, your concern for women's safety, again, slightly different across different studies, to what extent do those affect your views on this? And in addition, we then also just measured their attitudes towards trans people and their views on male violence. Again, we measured this slightly differently across different studies. Here's an example from one study. We used this measure across multiple studies, but not in all studies. So we asked them, for example, to indicate on a scale from -3 to +3, where -3 stood, I strongly prefer trans people to cis people, and +3 would be, I strongly prefer cisgender people to transgender people. So that then gives you a measure of bias, how much they like one group more than the other. In one of the studies, we also only asked about trans people just to make sure that this wasn't just about them really liking cis people. So we only asked about trans people, and one of the studies replicated beautifully. And then we also had this gender violence association. So in one of the studies we had, I strongly associate women with peace and men with violence, to I strongly associate women with violence and men with peace. In one of the other studies, we were like, okay, this is like a little removed from the arguments that people are actually making. So we also had some other measures where people indicated their agreement with statements such as, some men will always look for a loophole to gain access to vulnerable women, or it's really like women's safety is really important to me. So we measured this slightly differently across different studies. Okay, but what did we find? So this is just what people say, why they have the views that they have. So the yellow bars are their attitudes towards trans people, and the red bars are their male violence concerns. And this is across the different studies. And you can see here that for supporters who are on the right, the yellow bar is higher than the red bars. So they say their views, policy views, so their support for trans-inclusive policies is primarily driven by their attitudes towards trans people, more so than their male violence concerns. And for opponents, we see the opposite. So they say that male violence concerns are more important for informing their sort of views on trans-inclusive policies than their attitudes towards trans people. So this is a nice kind of reflection of that quote that I showed you in the beginning by J.K. Rowling, where she's saying, like, this isn't about trans people. I support trans people. This is really the true reason why I oppose these policies is because I'm concerned about male violence. Okay, so if this was actually the truth, then we should also find similar patterns in the correlations when we look at how are these things associated with each other, but we don't. Well, for supporters, we do. So when we look at supporters first, you can see that, so these are the correlations between their attitudes and their Gender Violence Association, respectively, and their support for trans-inclusive policies. So for supporters, you can see that their attitudes towards trans people is associated with support, negatively associated for support for trans-inclusive policies, such that if they have more negative attitudes, they're less supportive of these policies. Makes sense. So that's a correlation of minus 0.26. Their Gender Violence Association is also associated with support for trans-inclusive policies, but in the opposite direction, such that if they view men as more violent, they're more supportive of these policies. But if you just compare the size of these two correlations, the 0.26 is significantly stronger than the 0.13, meaning that what they're saying is driving their support is also more strongly driving their support. So trans attitudes are more strongly related to their views than Gender Violence Association is. For opponents, we find a similar pattern in the strength of the correlations, but this is not what they said, right? So they said the Gender Violence Association is actually the primary driver of their policy views, but that does not seem to be the case here. That 0.33 there is significantly stronger than that 0.15 below. So for them also, trans attitudes are the main driver of their opposition or of their lack of support, but that is not reflecting on what they said in their answers when we directly ask them. So in other words, for supporters of trans-inclusive policies, the reasons they give match the pattern in the data, but for opponents, they do not. But these correlational studies have limitations. So this is all correlational. We don't really have causal evidence that one thing is causing the other thing. We just know they're associated with each other. And also this reason measure is on an individual level, but the prediction is on the group level. So that's just kind of like, it could be that for individual people, their individual reasons that they're given are actually true. So we wanted some experimental evidence where we just like kind of push around trans attitudes and push around their sort of beliefs about male violence and see if that would affect their support for trans-inclusive policies. So if it's really just about their attitudes towards trans people, then pushing that around should affect their policy views. But if it is, like they said, if it is actually about male violence concerns, then pushing that around should have a stronger effect, because that should really be the thing that is driving their views. Of course, it's also hard to do. It's really hard to manipulate attitudes. It's really hard to manipulate stereotypes. People have pretty consistent and just consistent attitudes and consistent stereotypes. This is not something that is easily changed, unfortunately. And it's even harder to manipulate both in a parallel fashion and with equal strength, so that we can make strong claims. But we tried anyway, and I'm going to show you the results of that now. So we had two experimental studies, and these studies, all participants were opponents of trans-inclusive policies. So we were no longer really interested in understanding the supporters. I feel like we've done that across the correlational studies. Their patterns match what they're saying. They're not very interesting. I mean, they're great, but not very interesting in this specific research question. So in the first experimental study, we had about 700 US American cisgender opponents to trans-inclusive policies. We recruited them online. And then we had this between participants design based on an imagined contact paradigm. So in psychology, imagined contact is a form of prejudice reduction. So people then, like the way that this works is people imagine having a positive interaction with a member of a stigmatized group, and that has been shown to improve attitudes towards that group. It's kind of based on intergroup contact literature that shows that having positive contact with people from a stigmatized group does improve attitudes towards them. And this is kind of just making that all imagined, and that also has an effect, a weaker effect, but still has an effect. And so people were assigned randomly to one out of three conditions. So one group just imagined being at a party and wrote about that for 5 minutes. In the transgender condition, they imagined having a positive interaction with a transgender woman at a party. And then we try to adapt that to also change stereotypes around in this male violence or male peaceful man condition, where they imagined meeting a kind and gentle man at that party. So kind of a man who doesn't sort of fit these stereotypes of being aggressive or violent, which is a stereotype of men. And then we had the same measures of policy views as in the previous studies, where they indicated their agreement with these statements, such as trans women should have access to women's support groups and stuff like that. So this is kind of what they saw. So they saw this text: a good friend of yours is celebrating their birthday at a restaurant, has invited you. It's a big group of people, some of whom you know and some of whom you have never met before. And then everyone saw that. And then seated across from you is a woman you have never met, but who introduces herself as Emily. She's a good friend of the person who invited you. So that was only in a trans condition. And then it goes on to say Emily is a transgender woman. She was born biologically male and raised as a boy, but identifies as a woman. She came out as transgender during her teenage years and has been living as a woman for many years now. Emily seems like a nice and pleasant person. And then they're instructed to take 5 minutes to write about that interaction as a positive interaction. And so what did we find? So first we measured again this attitudes towards trans people, and these bars look very similar to each other, but there is in fact a significant effect. It's not very large, but it is there, such that the positive trans conditions, if they imagined having this positive interaction with this woman, they did have less bias towards trans people than in the control condition, but the peaceful man condition did exactly the same. So both of those lowered bias towards trans people. Not really sure why the peaceful man condition did that. Still don't know, but that's what happened. But there was absolutely no effect on this gender violence association. So on the views of male violence, we did not manage to push that around successfully in this study. And then if we just look at policy support, we find the pattern that we expected. So when people had imagined having this positive interaction with this trans woman, that bar in the middle, they were slightly more supportive of these trans inclusive policies than people in the other two conditions. So who either imagined just being at that party or who imagined interacting with this peaceful man. And then if you throw all of this into this mediation model, I'm not going to talk you through that in much detail. I just wanted to briefly show it to you that here, if you kind of look at this pathway through trans attitudes, you can see that that is significant. So when you push around trans attitudes, that also changes policy views. But this path through gender violence association is not significant. And in fact, if you just compare that last step of that model here, you see that trans attitudes and that is predicting policy views at a value of 0.75, minus 0.75. Gender violence association only 0.16. So that again is a much weaker link between these two constructs. So what we found in this specific study was that pushing around trans attitudes leads to changes in policy support, but we can't really make any claims about male violence beliefs. So if we just had that study, people could still say like, oh yeah, you pushed that around, but if you had pushed around those male violence beliefs, the effect would have been so much stronger. So actually what opponents say could be the truth, because you can't like make any claims about that at that point. And maybe this isn't surprising that we didn't manage to push around these male violence beliefs, because the imagined contact paradigm is really used to change attitudes, not stereotypes. So not kind of the attributes we associate with different groups. So now we adapted a paradigm that has been used to change stereotypes, which is this imagined future paradigm, where people are told in the future, these groups will be in different roles, and these roles are generally associated with different stereotypes. And then you also think that those groups that are in those roles will have those stereotypes. So for example, in the past, it has been shown that if you say in the future, way more women are going to be in leadership positions, and then you ask them, what do you think women will be like in that future? People also think that those women will be more assertive, more decisive, blah, 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 all these things that you associate with leadership positions. So we adapted that kind of paradigm. We had this 2x2 design, so people either were assigned to read about a future in which trans people were overrepresented in positive roles, so roles that people generally have positive attitudes towards, or were overrepresented overrepresented in roles that generally people have negative attitudes towards. And then we paired that with another condition where men were either overrepresented in peaceful occupations or in violent occupations, and women were overrepresented in the other one. And I'm going to show you what this looks like on the next slide. But again, we had over 700 US American opponents of trans-inclusive policies. This again was conducted online. We had the same measures as before, but this time we adapted it to apply to this future society that people read about. So this was the first paragraph of what they read. So they read that researchers now predict that in 25 to 30 years, transgender people will be more common in occupations such as telemarketers, car salespeople, or lawyers. And then the other half of the people read that they would be overrepresented in occupations such as firefighters, nurses, and people working for pet rescue organizations. Ran a pilot study before that to identify occupational groups that were either really liked or really disliked. Hopefully you can guess which ones are which. The idea was that if people read that transgender people would be overrepresented in the liked roles, so firefighters, nurses, and people working for pet rescue organizations, then maybe they would also like transgender people more in that society. And then we said that cisgender people were predicted to be particularly well represented in the other occupations. So if trans people were said to be more likely to be firefighters, nurses, and people working in pet rescue organizations, then cisgender people were said to be more likely to be telemarketers, car salespeople, and lawyers, and the other way around. And then to manipulate this gender violence association, we said that either women or men would be particularly common among bouncers, police officers, and among athletes such as boxers and hockey players. And then the other groups we said would be particularly well represented in occupations such as yoga instructor, florists, and massage therapists. And those were ones that were identified in that pilot study as being seen as particularly peaceful. And this time, yay, we managed to shift around this gender violence association. So what you can see here in this graph, you can see that in the peaceful men condition, so the two bars on the right, this gender violence association is lower than for the two bars on the left in the violent men condition. This also depended on the negative, which trans condition they were in. We're not really sure what was going on, but it seemed like that was particularly strong in the negative trans attitudes condition. We don't really know what's going on there because what we did not do, we did not successfully shift around trans attitudes with that attitude. So depending on what occupation people were in. So we didn't manipulate attitudes. We clearly did something because it had an effect on this gender violence association, but we, based on the measures we have, cannot say what exactly what that condition did. And this is then what we find for the support for trans-inclusive policies. So most importantly, there was no effect of the peaceful man condition, even though we had successfully pushed around these male violence beliefs. If supporters, opponents of trans-inclusive policies were correct in what they're saying is driving their opposition, then we should see an effect here. We should see that the violent men condition has less, the people in the violent men condition, so on the two bars on the left, should be lower than the two bars on the right, but they are not. We do see this variation and this interaction with the trans attitudes condition, but overall we do not see this effect that people were saying, opponents said we should see. So there's no evidence that concerns around male violence are the main reason for the opposition to trans-inclusive policies. Instead, negative attitudes are a stronger predictor. And so for supporters of trans-inclusive policies, the reasons that they give match the patterns in the data, but for opponents, they do not. And manipulating trans attitudes translates into changes in policy support, but manipulating male violence beliefs does not. So overall, there's little evidence that concerns for the safety of women play an important role here. And for me, what that really means is that it's important to look beyond the discourse and look at the underlying psychological factors. And that's what a lot of my work is doing. And I think also for activists, this is an important takeaway message, because we can address male violence concerns and why those don't make sense in this context all the livelong day, and that will probably not have any effect because that is not actually what is driving opposition. So what we need to focus on, I think, is changing attitudes. That's a hard thing to do, but I think that is really, I think just focusing on these overt arguments that are being made will unlikely lead to real change. I think that is my main takeaway from that research. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to all your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Thekla, for joining us today and for sharing your research. We're going to move to Q&A for our last 10 to 15 minutes. If folks want to use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I can read out your questions. I'm going to start off with a question in the chat from Shirley. You spoke of pushing around and manipulating attitudes. Does that invite backlash against your work and other similar work?
Like me pushing that around in my work? Is that the question? Maybe I should look at the question. Sorry.
I think so. I don't know, Shirley, if you want to clarify at all, but it sounds to me that, yeah, pushing, manipulating attitude or pushing your work forward.
I mean, that's like, maybe that's also like a psychology language thing. We do that a lot. Like we try to make causal claims. We push around people's beliefs all the time. So not really. I mean, our participants themselves, like we inform them afterwards, and they do have the opportunity to withdraw their consent after they know what the study was actually about. So they could, if they're like pissed off that we kind of misled them and made them change their views, then they can withdraw their consent and we will not use their data. Very few people do that. This depends, sort of in the reception of my work, this does not necessarily, I've not really received much backlash for that, because I think it's just a pretty normal thing we do in psychology. But sometimes when I do work, not so much with these, so these were all recruited via Prolific, which is this website where you can just recruit participants really easily and they get paid for their participation. And there it's fine. For some other studies, I've recruited more on social media and specifically sought out places that have a lot of gender critical feminists. And there, yeah, people absolutely hate it, even if you don't push around anything, even if they just think, oh, you have an agenda here, then they are pretty unhappy with that, and that has not been fun. But with these specific studies, it's been fine.
Great, thank you. And then another question in the Q&A box. Thank you for your interesting presentation, and I see a lot of gratitude coming in the chat as well for your work. Are there any studies or insights about people's comfort level with having transgender individuals in women's bathrooms versus men's bathrooms? It seems to me that the comparison would clarify how important the violent man concern truly is.
Yeah, there's very little, that's just not something that's very prominent in the discourse around that. I think there is something interesting there about why is that not? And if you process, so if you're saying that people are the gender that matches their sex assigned at birth, if that is your worldview, then you should also be concerned about these transgender men who you should view as women going into the men's restroom because they would be at risk. And I think the fact that that is not a prominent part of discourse tells you a lot about that it's not about male violence, but that is not really something that has been investigated very much. So I don't really know of any studies looking at that specifically. And yeah, the discourse doesn't really focus on that very much. I think if anything at all, I think what we find is kind of this idea of oh, women need to be saved. We do see that also in the discourse around trans men, but more in the context of young, teenage, kids and young transgender men. This idea that they are actually women who are being sort of seduced by this trans agenda and talked into mutilating their bodies. So I think there's also this rhetoric of oh, we need to save the women is pretty prominent in all, for both trans men and trans women and non-binary people, but it takes on very different forms. And I think that actually tells us a lot, but definitely we need more research on that as well.
Great, thank you. I see a question from Hannah. Could attitudes towards trans people be related to beliefs around precarious manhood? I don't know, Hannah, if you want to elaborate on that at all.
I mean, maybe this is the inverse, and that is to say it's more kind of ironically, the threat to men is more about the story here, and I was just wondering, has anybody looked at, variation in beliefs about precarious manhood, the need to, you should talk about it. I'm sure you know that. I'll leave it to you to answer that. Maybe the audience might want a little bit of an explanation of that. But do you have, do you know, I know of research related to that? I was thinking of it, looking at your results.
Yeah, so for those of you not familiar with that sort of literature, so the idea of precarious manhood is, so across many cultures and many studies, it has been shown that manhood compared to womanhood is much more seen as something that has to be won and is more easily lost. So for example, men, when you make them like do a feminine task such as braiding hair as opposed to just braiding a rope or something like that, and then like that threatens their manhood, and then in turn they would act more aggressively or punch something more harder to kind of restore their manhood. And one of the forms that can also take this restoring of manhood is violence or negative attitudes towards gay men, for example. So as a group that sort of threatens men as in general, threatens men's status because they don't adhere to these anti-femininity norms. I don't know of any research that has specifically looked at this, but some of my data from another project also made me think about this. So in that project, we were interested in gender nonconformity and identity denial. So whether presenting in a way that is not in line with your gender identity, how that can cause people to perceive you as not a real man or not a real woman, and in turn, say oh, this person should use the women's bathroom even though they identify as a man, or that person shouldn't be in these spaces that are in line with their gender. For both transgender and cisgender people, interestingly, we find the same patterns. So what we generally find is that people who don't present in line with their gender identity have their identity denied more often and are assigned to the incorrect spaces. But how this ties with precarious manhood is that in one of the studies, we gave them these images. So for example, they saw a man who was wearing makeup, had long hair, was presenting in a very feminine way, but was saying, my name is James, I'm a guy who likes blah, blah, blah. So they got information that this person identifies as a man. And then we asked them, to what extent would you say this person is a man? To what extent would you say this person is a woman? And then which spaces should this person use, or which should this person be allowed in male only support groups and so on. So we just asked them all these kinds of questions. And what we found there was that only the extent to which people perceived people as men mattered for identity denial. So both for women and men, so male and female targets, or targets who identified as men and targets who identified as women, to what extent they were seen as women had nothing to do with which groups they were assigned to later on. So whether people said, oh, this person should go to the women's bathroom or the men's bathroom. Only perceptions of manhood mattered. And so that to me seems to suggest that there is a precarious manhood and something about manhood that's specific, or something that's specific to manhood, not so much about womanhood, that is going on in this trans, in many questions related to trans people. But as far as I know, no one has looked at that explicitly.
Great, thank you so much. Another question comes through the chat. Were you able to control for the reasons for subjects' trans attitudes? In other words, do your findings change significantly based on whether trans attitudes are rooted in religion, culture, politics, etc.?
No, we didn't really ask about why they oppose this. So we did not control for religiosity or just general conservatism or anything like that. So yeah, we didn't have any of those measures in there. And it could be that those things play a role. We didn't look at that here.
Great, thanks. I think Hannah has another question if you want to go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to jump in, thank you. So Megan Tusi, I don't know if you've encountered her and her work. She does some work in the negotiation realm. They have some she and co-authors have some work in progress looking at if you're going to negotiate with someone who identifies as non-binary or cisgender, I guess. And what they're finding is that it doesn't matter to younger people, so on a college campus, but when they look at an older population, that they're more comfortable with somebody. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how I love your manipulation of kind of reflecting on a positive counter and whether or not there's any other data on people who just through their lived experience have more opportunity for positive encounters, and whether that's having any effect on, say, political or behavior or attitudes toward policy.
Yeah, so both from studies that just show like, oh, do you have any family members, any friends, or like how many people do you know who are transgender, who are non-binary? Both that is related to more positive attitudes and more positive policy views, and also like sort of I think there was one study that actually had a real interaction, so not this imagined contact that I just described, but a real interaction with a trans woman, and that also had an effect. So there are studies, and the age thing is really interesting because I perceive this as a very strongly age-related thing, where like younger people are just much more comfortable with this and are like have much more open ideas about gender and less rigid and less binary ideas, and like don't necessarily think gender and sex are so much related. So that is also what I perceive. I think there's also studies backing that up. But what I find really interesting, this is slightly off topic, but I just feel like this is so fascinating, and so I'm just going to share it anyway. So I have this study with like representative samples from the UK and the US, and these are like, and we asked people, are you a feminist or not? And so then we looked only at the feminists. So the feminists are not representative, but the sample they came from, where we just asked, are you a feminist? That was a representative sample. And we also asked that sample about their views on trans issues, and that was to age among feminists. It was like age was like, I mean, there was a correlation, but it was not strong. It was maybe 0.1 or something like that, like not a strong association at all. Whereas with other things, for example, their views on sex work strongly correlated with age, with like younger people having much more positive attitudes towards like the decriminalization of sex work than older people. With this trans issue, there was not a strong relationship, which I find interesting. And given that that's kind of contrast with what we find in general samples that aren't feminists, that also kind of leads me to believe that there's something different going on for feminists than for the general population.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for engaging with us today. Lots of healthy discussion in the chat. I'm so glad to see so many people interested in this topic. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege to close this out, but also ask a final question that maybe is a bigger picture question around our work at the Women in Public Policy program, because I know there's a lot of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners in our community and on this call who are trying to ensure that we don't reinforce or defend the gender binary in our research specifically, but our work more generally. And as we navigate, this landscape of anti-trans rhetoric and policy that's going on in the US right now, just wondering if you had any thoughts on how can gender equity researchers ensure their work is acknowledging and including and amplifying trans and non-binary folks, whether it's through data collection, analysis, or dissemination?
Yeah, so I think one sort of important thing is to make sure I talked about gender performativity at some point, and I think as researchers we often contribute to that by just having a sample and then dividing them into women and men, and then looking at that and just excluding everyone else who doesn't neatly fall into those boxes. And then of course, surprise, surprise, you find differences between women and men, or how something affects women or men. And I think being explicit about that, and being in this study, we did not have the numbers, so we cannot speak to how that might affect trans people. We cannot speak about how this might affect non-binary people. Just being explicit about this can help, I think, in the communication. Being inclusive, when it comes to policies that are there to benefit women, to make sure that to think about who should this benefit. Sometimes we use women as a proxy for people who might have babies at some point, and then we should maybe make that policy actually for people who have given birth or will give birth at some point. Or sometimes you make policies for people who are disadvantaged because they were socialized in a certain way, and then we should think about what can we use as a proxy for socialization in a certain way. I think there are many, especially when we think about women's rights and ensuring that women and women's gender equality and the equity for women. I think that's an incredibly important topic, and I think that's something we need to pay attention to. But I think it would be useful to think about what aspect of that are we thinking about. So what is it what is the form of like discrimination or a disadvantage that women face here? And can we just address that? So can we, for example, do something that's just benefiting people who menstruate? Can we do something that benefits people who have gone on parental leave? Can we do like, I think thinking about it in those terms and making that inclusive can be really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'm really sorry we weren't able to get to all of our questions today, but really thankful for your time, Dr. Morgenroth, for spending some time sharing your amazing research with us on this really important topic. And hopefully we can continue this conversation moving forward.